Welcome. In this session, we're discussing the preferential option for the poor and the universal destination of goods, two very important economic issues.
St. Paul says, share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality.
What can we at Newman and other local communities share with people in need?
We can share different foods or other things that people need, like clothing. And at Newman, we have a rice bowl where we donate money to people in need and other things during Lent.
We can share clothes, food, water, and if someone's new at your school, you can help them make friends.
Jesus says, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind in. You will be blessed.
So I'm quoting from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Those who are oppressed by poverty are the object of a preferential option for the poor on the part of the Church. Friar Tim, what is the meaning of the preferential option for the poor?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. It's actually a fairly recent phrasing in Catholic moral theology. But let me back up and give a little bit of kind of the historical background. Let's go back to the scripture, first of all. When we go back even to the Old Testament and the book of Deuteronomy, the whole question of the law is always connected to how one treats immigrants, strangers, widows, orphans, the poor. So that's a very clear notion. And again, the fundamental biblical text of the Old Testament, the revelation on Mount Sinai, is that God hears and pays attention to the sufferings of the afflicted and the oppressed. And that plays itself out, frankly, in the New Testament. If you notice that the first of the Beatitudes has to do with either poverty or poverty of spirit, depending on whether you're watching or looking at Luke or Matthew. And the whole question of the Last Judgment is really about the marginalized, the poor, and everything else. So this is kind of fundamental to Christianity. Prior to Constantine's conversion in 325 AD, the whole question of Christianity as caring for the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, is something that Roman society, which was very callous about these things, noted as a particular hallmark of Christianity. And that got, in a sense, very codified in the Middle Ages, where charity towards the poor was an obligation of an individual and also an obligation of all church institutions. That got further codified in what was called the Union of Throne and Altar, in which people paid tithes to the church, and from those tithes to the church that were civilly mandated, the church cared for the poor, the widow, the orphan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's only after that when there is this disestablishment of the church, that the church finds new ways of talking about its clear care for the poor. And it starts with a basis of charity first, but slowly over the course of time, frankly, beginning with, as many things do in this whole concept of Catholic social teaching, beginning with Rerum Novarum in 1891, the church consistently says that it must start with charity, but slowly over the course of time, charity must be joined to justice, in which case we start looking at some of the structural inequalities in society. And this is particularly moved by the Latin American bishops in what's called CELAM, the Episcopal Conference of Latin America and the Caribbean, which began the impetus towards liberation theology, in which case preferential option for the poor comes much more into Catholic mainstream as an idea. Sorry for the history background, but it's very important that I think everyone understands this question of preferential option for the poor, that it's a new term, but it is deeply rooted in the tradition.
Well, we're next going to call upon Patrick Conway. who is today's expert on the economy. He's Professor Emeritus in economics at the UNC School of Public Health, and he's been a member of the Newman Parish since 1983. So Patrick, the free market economic system has been very successful in facilitating economic growth. Why then does poverty persist both worldwide and in our own country?
Thank you, Carl, and welcome everyone. In a free market, the price that we pay is driven by the interplay of supply and demand. The suppliers bring the good to the market and will sell them at the highest price. That price is given by those who are most best able to purchase it, who have the income, who are able to pay. Economists find that this competition of consumers to get goods in a free market leads to the most efficient allocation of goods. The goods go to the people who value them the most, at least in dollar terms. And that high price means that more suppliers will want to sell more in the market. All of these things lead to rapid economic growth. In today's discussion, Friar Tim has given a very good description of the concept of the preferential option of the poor and its role in Catholic social teaching. Poverty can persist in a free market mainly because in that market, the individuals who get the product are typically the ones who can afford it. They're willing and able to pay. That means that the free market has what I'll call the opposite of the preferential option of the poor. We have a preferential option for the rich. If we have two families in need of the goods and services that you require to live in dignity, one family has income, the other does not. The family with income will be able to buy what's needed. The family without income will not. Those who are in poverty will remain in poverty. Economic growth is wonderful, and the free market generates economic growth, but there's a persistence to poverty that is going to occur for extended periods of time. And that's something that Catholic social teaching tells us to watch out for and to remedy when possible.
Again, Patrick, don't governments in free market economics provide anti-poverty programs? Are these examples of a preferential option for the poor?
Thanks for the question, Carl. I'm going to have to put on my economist hat here and say that the answer has to be yes and no. Yes, governments in countries with free market economies can provide for the poor and for the excluded through what we call social policies, programs that distribute goods and services to those who can't afford them. Countries of Western Europe are quite well developed in that regard. So yes, we'd say these types of government programs do embody what we call the preferential option for the poor. But on the other hand, no. Social programs, as they are designed, will help the poor and will be the type of preferential option that we would like to see. But in practice, many of these programs do not deliver on what they had promised. So just to take one example from North Carolina, the North Carolina Constitution guarantees that all children in North Carolina have the right to a basic, sound education beginning from early childhood. That, taken alone, would be very much a preferential option for the poor, because otherwise, with private education, the education you receive would be what you would pay for. If you pay a lot, you get a very high quality education. If you cannot pay, you'll get no education at all. So the guarantee of a sound basic education is something that is very valuable to the children of North Carolina, especially those who live in poverty. In practice, though, even back beginning in the 1990s, our court system has indicated that our state is not delivering on its promise, that those who are in the poorest counties were not getting a sound basic education. In that case, we wouldn't call it a preferential option for the poor anymore. It becomes very much a preferential option for the rich. So in that case, the program in principle is quite sound. The program in practice is not as helpful. Additionally, we can say no. Pope Francis reminds us that social policy, and I quote, must not only favor the preferential option on the poor, the marginalized and the excluded, but also respect them. Others must be acknowledged and esteemed precisely as others, each with his or her own feelings, choices, and ways of living and working. Social policies, as we've talked about, can reallocate goods and services, and we can certainly assist the poor in that way. But Pope Francis is calling us to go even beyond that and to make the poor visible to ourselves and to those around us through our charity and our advocacy.
In his encyclical Popularum Progresso, Pope Paul VI stated, "All other rights, including property rights and the rights of free trade, must be subordinated to the universal destination of goods." So, Friar Tim, will you please expand on the meaning of the universal destination of goods?
Yeah. When the church began to systematically do social/spiritual analysis on economy and poverty, beginning in the 19th century and progressing all the way through, what was very clear is that there is a gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And no matter how much that an economic system and economic growth produces, there's still this gulf between the haves and the have-nots. We see it somewhat in the United States, but frankly, this is even more glaring if you've ever been in any capital city in the third world, or any large city in a place like India or Nigeria or Kenya, all of which places I've been, in which you will see a multi-million-dollar high-rise right next to a hovel. And it becomes very, very stark. So the question comes in that if there is this continuing gulf between the haves and the have-nots, it is somewhat easier to say that somehow this is how God has destined things. And this is the basis of what in many Christian circles has come to be called the prosperity gospel. That is, that God has destined certain people for prosperity, and they of course should be charitable, but the poor, oh well, as the scripture says, you will always have them with you. Catholic teaching says, yes, the poor you will always have with you, but to think that those who are on the higher world class of socioeconomic stability have some kind of predestined divine right to that, as opposed to more willingly sharing that with other people, is a fallacy. Now, what that sharing looks like and how that sharing takes place and what exactly is the level of sharing here. Are we talking about, a complete and total redistribution of wealth? Catholic teaching would say that goes a little bit too far. On the other hand, to think that we're perfectly happy where we are with so many people on the edge of starvation or inability to have health care or inability to have water or destined to live in highly polluted environments because of development in another area, to think that that's somehow good is against where the church moves on the wider, bigger issues.
So, Friar Tim, this important social justice principle is rarely mentioned in Catholic social teaching. Why is this so?
Unfortunately, it's because it does sound somewhat socialist/communist. It just does. And here we have to go back to one of the very basic principles that becomes articulated in Catholic social teaching way back in 1891 with Rerum Novarum. That is, that the right to private property is in fact a human right, but that human right is not absolute. And what does it mean when private property gets so absolutized that we no longer sense that we have a social responsibility towards those who have much, much less than we do? In fact, to the point where their integral human development is in fact hampered because they do not have access to this destination of all goods. And that's the thorny thing of how does one make that happen is a much more complicated thing. I have a quote here from what's called the Compendium of Catholic Social Doctrine. It is a document put out by the Holy See. It's available on the Vatican's website, www.vatican.va/resources. You just click on to the resources piece. And the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching says this in number 182. The principle of the universal destination of goods requires that the poor, the marginalized, and in all cases, those whose living conditions interfere with their proper growth should be the focus of particular concern. Requires, should be. To this end, the preferential option for the poor should be reaffirmed in all of its force. I think those are rather strong words that it would be good for us to contemplate a little bit what those mean.
Well, Patrick, does the free market economic system guarantee the universal destination of goods?
Thank you for the question, Carl. Friar Tim has given us an excellent description of the universal destination of goods. Pope Francis has a definition as well. Let me read it to you. He says, "The goods of the earth are destined for the whole human race, and as a fundamental principle that's established even before the principle of private property. The free market system, taken alone then, is just a way to reallocate goods from supplier to consumer, from owner to new owner, based upon those who are willing and able to pay the price." That means that private property is reinforcing this preferential option for the rich. Those without income, or those without savings, those without ability to purchase, find themselves left out, unable to access those goods that Pope Francis tells us have a universal destination. For goods and services to be available universally, it is our responsibility as those who own more than we need to provide the excess and make it available to those who are in need. We become a critical part of the universal destination of goods, because if we don't stand up as individuals who can afford the goods to purchase them and then redistribute them to others, the market itself will not achieve that universal destination that we're talking about. We can do this through our charity. We can also do this through our advocacy with governments to provide social policies, social programs, to make that reallocation of goods and services to those who cannot afford. The free market system alone will not guarantee the universal destination of goods taken by itself.
Friar Tim, if changes to make our economy a more just one requires political as well as economic means, what is the role of the Catholic Church in promoting political action for economic justice?
Again, a very thorny question. The church's proper role is to form consciences, and the church's proper role is to inform consciences around the whole question of the common good and the inherent rights and responsibility of each individual, which includes the rights and responsibilities of the poor, the oppressed, and those who are marginalized in society. Now, that's what the church's proper role is. The church has long had a temptation of trying to dictate politics in a system that what is called integralism. That is, that a Catholic state should be enforcing Catholic principles. The church formally eschewed this as a doctrine and as a preferential political setup at the Second Vatican Council. And in a slow process that began in the 19th century, it reached its fruition in 1965. There are, however, certain Catholic intellectual elements, mostly from the right end of the political system, but a few from the left end of the political system, that would talk about the importance of an integralist Catholic government that would, in fact, force and employ all of these things. The problem with all of that is, what do you do with the people that disagree? And what do you do if Catholicism is not a 100% majority? What do you do with the minorities who do not agree? The church's proper role is not to enforce politics, but to form consciences so that people in their political involvement might work towards a common good that talks about a universal destination of goods and a preferential option for the poor.
How can the Catholic Church in this country, including laity, religious, priests, bishops, become more aware and committed to these fundamental social justice issues, such as the preferential option for the poor and the universal destination of goods?
I think it occurs by doing precisely what we're doing here, which is a process of education and a process of further synodal dialogue. Unfortunately, these economic issues that are very tightly woven with political issues, as your previous question suggests, in a very deeply politically polarized world and a deeply politically polarized country, people tend to retreat more easily into their political camps rather than very serious synodal dialogue, which, as Pope Francis recommends to us always, involves an open ear to listen to other opinions and an open heart to actually accept them and listen more than argue, and dialogue more than combat and have to win. It's a long, slow process, but that is precisely what we should be doing, also precisely around these questions of Catholic social teaching.
Thank you, Friar Tim.
And thank you, Carl, for your insightful questions.